The narrative circulating about the family stirred deep emotions among those who heard it, prompting a desire to offer support during a turbulent time. Reports surfaced suggesting that Tom Parker Bowles had inadvertently caused concern regarding his proximity to King Charles's private estate. During the period when the king was receiving medical care, questions arose about the degree to which Tom was being integrated into daily royal operations. What began as a private family matter seemingly expanded into a complex issue regarding the boundaries of royal protocol and established tradition. Speculation grew regarding whether these moves were merely about family closeness or represented an attempt to shift the established dynamics surrounding Prince William. The history between Charles and Camilla began decades before their marriage, rooted in a connection that formed outside the spotlight of public duty. Their relationship was built on a shared understanding and quiet companionship that persisted despite the complications of their separate lives. Although time and circumstance initially pulled them in different directions, the underlying emotional tie remained unbroken and lingered in the background. Life continued for both on separate paths, yet the bond between them felt like a conversation that had been paused rather than finished. It was a connection defined by years of restraint, heavily influenced by the strict requirements of their royal roles. When their paths finally converged again years later, the reunion was marked by a sense of gravity rather than simple, unburdened joy. Reconnecting felt like opening a door to the past, bringing with it the weight of all the years that had been lost in silence. While their partnership provided them with personal comfort, it inevitably stirred unresolved emotions regarding the history that had preceded it. The past refused to stay behind them, moving alongside them into a world that was already strained by the demands of public service. Their union felt less like a whirlwind romance and more like a destiny that had stubbornly refused to be set aside. The king's children grew up witnessing the gradual dissolution of the domestic stability they had once known within their homes. They observed the shift from warmth to distance, watching as care and affection were slowly replaced by palpable tension. Days that had once been filled with easy laughter became characterized by careful silence and a sense of walking on eggshells. The affection within the household did not vanish instantly, but eroded slowly through missed connections and heavy unspoken pauses. These experiences taught them early on that family dynamics could shift without warning, leaving a lasting impression on their view of trust. Conversely, the Queen's children experienced a different reality, standing on the periphery of the marriage while still feeling its heavy societal weight. Their names became inextricably pushed into a public narrative that many people viewed with criticism and judgment. They felt the scrutiny of the public eye, often sensing a quiet resentment directed toward them for reasons beyond their control. In response to this pressure, they learned to remain guarded and alert, developing a protective instinct over their own lives. While others might speak freely, they adopted a habit of silence, absorbing the surrounding tension without giving it a voice. Over the years, a natural defensiveness became their shield, forged from being linked to a relationship that others had viewed with skepticism. When the families gathered together, the underlying strain was often palpable, even when no harsh words were spoken aloud. Polite smiles frequently masked deeper divides, keeping conversation shallow to avoid touching upon the painful history beneath the surface. Every glance seemed to carry weight, and every pause in the conversation felt sharper than it would in a less complicated family. Although no one explicitly named the hurt, it sat between them, shaping every interaction and making shared moments feel staged. The Queen noticed these dynamics acutely, seeing how her children often stepped back to let others take the spotlight. In her view, her children were paying the social cost of her own history and the complex nature of her marriage. This belief strengthened over time, shaping how she perceived every slight delay or lack of recognition afforded to her son. Feelings of maternal guilt mixed with frustration, leading her to feel that expecting endless patience from them was no longer fair. She began to believe that after years of endurance, the time had come to correct what she perceived as an imbalance. Her thoughts slowly crystallized into a resolve to ensure her son received the respect she felt he had earned. Remembering her own long journey of waiting for acceptance, she refused to let her children walk that same difficult path. She determined that Tom deserved a recognized space within the inner circle, not in the distant future, but in the present. The idea of leaving him on the outside felt increasingly unbearable, causing her maternal care to evolve into specific planning. She believed that the royal structure could accommodate him if the issue was pressed with enough certainty and persistence. Her son sensed this shift in expectations before any explicit words were spoken regarding his elevation. He had learned to remain careful and unobtrusive, understanding that the world he stood near was both powerful and precarious. Although he doubted he truly belonged in the center, the growing pressure and opportunity began to affect his perspective. He felt torn between his natural caution and the allure of the status that was being quietly offered to him. Watching others move with such confidence made him wonder what it would be like to stand firmly among them. Looking ahead, his mother refused to accept a future where her child remained in the background of history. She viewed this not as greed, but as a necessary repensing of the family's narrative and standing. She decided that waiting was no longer a viable option, and that Tom should claim a more visible role. Consequently, Tom began to move through royal spaces with increased frequency and a newfound sense of purpose. He observed the environment closely, learning which rooms welcomed him and which ones tightened with tension upon his arrival. He quickly learned where the boundaries lay, and that knowledge shaped his restraint and his patience within the palace. Over time, his presence increased without any formal announcement, appearing at gatherings and staying without explanation. Although he was not placed front and center, he was no longer hidden in the shadows of the establishment. The daily schedule seemed to bend slightly to include him, allowing doors to open with greater ease. This shift was quiet and almost gentle, yet it carried a deliberate intent that the staff began to notice. A pattern soon emerged that few within the household could ignore as protocols began to blur. He was occasionally guided to positions usually reserved for senior royals, entering rooms moments after others had stepped away. The staff often hesitated, unsure of where the correct instruction lay, as notes meant for the heir drifted toward him. Small deviations in protocol multiplied, with a seat changed here and a task moved there. While each moment seemed harmless alone, together they formed a troubling picture that felt more like a rehearsal than a coincidence. Prince William sensed the change in the atmosphere without initially grasping its specific source or intent. The air around his familiar spaces felt altered, and he noticed pauses in conversation where there were none before. He often felt observed in moments that used to be private, as if his path was being mirrored. Nothing openly challenged his position, yet something pressed close, following him through halls and meetings. The palace felt tighter to him, as if it were making room for someone else without asking for his consent. From a distance, the Queen watched patiently, speaking to Tom in careful ways to shape his view. She framed any resistance he encountered as a test of his resolve and interpreted silence as approval. She pointed out that doors which once seemed closed could open, teaching him that space is often claimed before it is granted. Her guidance was soft yet firm, nudging him forward to turn his caution into active consideration. She encouraged him to see these moves not as intrusions, but as a natural evolution of his place in the family. At first, he pushed back against these suggestions, fearing that stepping forward would invite unnecessary conflict. He knew the risk of being seen as a challenge to the established order and valued his peace and safety. However, his mother reshaped his fear into purpose, presenting the moment as a natural order rather than ambition. She described the path as being guided by fate, which eased his internal resistance to the idea. As his doubts softened, the pull of belonging grew stronger, and he began to accept the space offered. His steps became firmer as he lingered longer in spaces where he previously would have hurried past. He told himself that nothing was being taken from others, but that he was simply moving into voids that appeared. This distinction mattered to him, easing his conscience as he navigated the complex hierarchy of the household. He did not clearly see the line he was crossing. He only felt the ground shift beneath his feet. By the time he chose to step forward fully, the choice felt as though it had already been made for him. Access was granted that had never been formally written down or approved by the usual channels. Invitations arrived without fanfare, subtly guiding him into meetings and areas usually restricted to senior figures. Staff began to respond to him as if his requests carried official weight, unlocking doors to private rooms. Each step forward felt ordinary to outsiders, but the arrangement was carefully engineered to bypass standard protocol. Repetition made his presence familiar, and that familiarity made it seem rightful to those watching. His appearances became normalized to the point that no announcements or explanations were deemed necessary. The staff grew accustomed to seeing him in locations where he was not historically meant to be. Chairs were filled and spaces were crossed without scrutiny, repeating until the unusual became the everyday routine. Each day his sphere of influence grew slightly larger, appearing quietly alongside those with long-standing authority. The household shifted in subtle ways, learning to accept him without formal recognition or question. Behind closed doors, he was made to understand that rules could bend when perception was carefully managed. The situation was framed as a matter of destiny rather than ambition, suggesting the institution would respond to confidence. He was reminded that the king's health kept him distant, leaving gaps in oversight that needed filling. Every whisper of hesitation was met with reassurance that these acts of presence were merely temporary positioning. He was told he could move freely because the moment was right and the perceived risk was low. Although he initially struggled with the weight of his choices, the absence of immediate consequence softened his worry. He questioned if it was right to utilize these openings, yet the calm influence guiding him was persuasive. Slowly, his hesitation melted into a quiet confidence, and the palace felt less like a trap. He viewed it more as a stage where he could learn to perform and claim presence without accusation. Each new privilege became a trial run, helping him learn the subtle rhythm of authority. A private estate that was usually kept quiet and untouched became the next setting for this expansion. It was a place rarely entered, except by those granted formal permission, yet he moved through it as though he belonged. He did not pause for approval, and the staff, seeing his confidence, hesitated briefly before obeying. Instructions were given quietly, and the authority was assumed to come from the highest level. Rooms that had been closed for years opened with ease, adjusting to his presence. Furniture was shifted and spaces were assessed, making the estate feel less like a borrowed place and more like an opportunity. He tested routines and observed the staff, learning which doors remained locked and which could be crossed. Every action felt small, yet together they built a sense of command over the environment. He dismissed hesitation as unnecessary, viewing gaps in oversight as simple circumstances to be utilized. The estate, once sacred in its stillness, became flexible under this new plan. At first, he approached cautiously, fully aware of the weight of the boundaries he was navigating. He did not intend to alter the natural order, yet the silent space invited movement and decision. He realized that familiarity bred authority, and the line he crossed became nearly invisible to him. He began to act as if his permanence there was natural, not merely assumed or temporary. The estate seemed to accept him, bending quietly to the cadence of command he had learned. Unknown to him, a quiet observer noticed the discrepancies that were accumulating within the household's operations. Prince Edward had always been a figure who moved with a calm that masked his sharp attention to detail. While others dismissed him as passive, he had spent decades mastering the intricacies of estates and trusts. He recognized where authority truly rested and identified the gaps where procedure had been ignored. His experience gave him a patience that now served as a shield against the unfolding changes. Edward noticed small inconsistencies, such as permissions appearing without proper signatures and schedules aligning unusually. Nothing overtly illegal was visible to the casual observer, but his trained eye saw a pattern of overreach. He began to connect the dots, tracing small actions back to their source within the updated palace structure. He realized that access was being granted without approval, and authority was being assumed rather than earned. The magnitude of the intrusion became clear as he documented the deliberate nature of the plan. Rather than confront the issue directly, Edward chose discretion and documented every incident to create a precise record. He knew that confrontation without evidence could appear petty, so he focused on preparation and facts. He waited to ensure that when action was taken, it could not be dismissed as merely reactionary. Eventually, he completed a report addressed to the proper authorities containing evidence and context. This document would act as a tool to correct the overreach without causing a public spectacle. The palace walls seemed to hum with tension as the details coalesced into a clear picture for the senior royals. Prince William observed the unfolding facts with a controlled intensity and decided to act with precision. Privileges and access that had been granted quietly over the years were immediately reviewed and revoked. The palace adjusted quickly, restoring the order that had been slowly eroded by the informal arrangements. What had been tolerated was now firmly restricted, and the shift was felt immediately. Tom felt the shift almost immediately as tasks once permitted were revoked and invitations disappeared. The spaces he had begun to occupy comfortably now felt unfamiliar and distant to him. The reach of the crackdown extended further, curtailing the positions of relatives who had benefited from informal arrangements. Lines of influence that had quietly built over time were severed to reinforce the main line of authority. Offices that had allowed informal power were cleared, forcing a recognition of the new reality. The Queen realized the full extent of the shift as her carefully orchestrated plans collapsed under scrutiny. King Charles, while physically weakened, supported the reestablishment of order and the integrity of the institution. The palace, once pliant under careful direction, had regained control, and the family operated in strict alignment. Tom disappeared from informal spaces, learning the harsh lesson that opportunity alone could not create legitimacy. The monarchy remained stable, but the lessons of overreach lingered as a reminder of the fragility of boundaries.